the event args. Then when you see any of these drive types, you know there's extra information, and that means I can come in here and type in e dot and see that information and start using that in my code behind. In this video, I'll look at how to subscribe to an event, or another way of saying it, to set up an event handler from within my XAML file. This example I have in this main window.xaml file. I have some UI here. I have a grid that contains a border, and inside the border is an image. And I'm setting a property here on the image control, which is called a render transform. And inside that, I specified a skew transform. So what a skew transform does is allow me to change my rectangular object and change the angles of the corners. So I no longer have 90-degree corners. So I've got this skew transform in here, and I'll manipulate this on the mouse up event. So what I need to do is wire up an event handler here in my XAML for a mouse up event. So I'll do that here on the image class. And we'll ignore what's in the dropdown for the moment. So I typed in mouse up equal example method. So this is the event. And when you wire up an event handler or subscribe to an event, you have to have a method that has the correct signature. So the C# compiler is going to verify that there is a method called example method. And it's going to look in a class. So in WPF, the way you relate the XAML file to a .NET class is by looking at what's at the top of the XAML file. Here on line 1. This x:class specifies that any code that's affiliated with this XAML file will be inside this main window class. So if you go over, look at my C# file here, this CS file, you'll see that up here I've got a public partial class main window. So somewhere in this class, I need to have an example method. If I try to compile this project right now, I'll get an error that says main window does not contain a definition for example method, and no extension method excepting the first argument can be found. So I would have to go over here, create this method, and let's save this and build. Now it's finding the method, but it can't find one that has the correct signature. And I talked about this in the last video, but now I need to make sure it matches the delegate signature. So it's not good to type it in manually. I mean, you can, but there's some other tools in Visual Studio that will help you do this. So let me delete this method. We'll go back over to the XAML file, delete this bit of XAML here and try again. So say mouse up equal. Now this time, let's look at what Visual Studio is showing me. It's showing me two choices. There's something called new event handler and there's mouse handler. So it's looked through my C# code behind file and found there's one method called mouse handler that has the correct signature on it. So if I choose this, like that, now when I compile, I shouldn't get an error anymore. And now let's go take a look at the code over here. C#. This is the method that I wrote, mouse handler, and it has the correct signature, object O and mouse button event args M. Now remember, the names of these are not important. If you're using Microsoft naming conventions, this would be E, and this would be sender over here, like that. I've got M in here, so I'll go ahead and leave this second argument at M. And what I'm doing here is I'm getting some information about which button the user clicked when they did a mouse up. And so I can use M here to find out more information. So I've got an if statement here that says, if the changed button was the left button, then run this code. Otherwise, if the changed button was the right button, then run this code. And you see I'm changing the angle of the X values here or the angle of the Y values here. So let's see what this looks like when I run the application. I'll click with my left button. Now I'll click with my right button. Now back to the XAML. Another way of entering the information in your XAML editor is to do it like this. Go back here, erase mouse up, type it in again. Now here's that IntelliSense window popping up again. And the top item is new event handler. So if I choose this one, it says over here, bind an event to a newly created method called food image _ mouse up. So it's picking a name based on the fact that I have a name for my image called food image, and the name of the event is mouse up. So it's going to generate a method using those two bits of information. So let me go back over here. I've lost the IntelliSense window. To bring it back in Visual Studio, I can press Control Spacebar. That'll pop it up again. And I'll choose this item here. And you see that it's stubbed in this bit of XAML for me. And here's the nice thing that it also does. You go look at the C# code. Visual Studio also wrote out the method using the correct signature. So it marked as private. Return parameter is void. There's the name that was suggested over in the XAML editor. And here's the signature that Microsoft likes to use. object sender, mouse button event args equal E. And also Microsoft is using this convention where you put an underscore between the two parts of the method. This is the object, food image, this is the event. The property window in Visual Studio is very useful for looking at the values that are set for properties on any element defined in your XAML. So I'm in this main window XAML file. I'm looking at these different elements like this image element, and I can see the properties. Now, if you don't see the property window, you can bring it onto the screen by going to View, scrolling down near the end and choosing Properties window. Now this currently is set to show me the properties by category. And I can select my image and then go to Common and see the source of the image is this pretzel JPEG file, and I can see the values for stretch and so on. So not only can I look at these values, but I can also edit them. This is very useful when you're not looking at your XAML file. Say that you've switched over to just looking at the designer only. So you look at the designer and you look at the property window to see the values. And you can also change those like this. I can go to the stretch property, choose to set the stretch to none, and you see I get a different look here. And you'll see that I have a different value in my XAML. I can also change the source by clicking on this drop down and picking another picture inside my project. Most developers I know that work in WPF know about the properties window. What's lesser known is that there's another section of the properties window over here called event handlers. So I'll click this and it'll take me to this list that shows all of the event handlers that are defined for this image class. This is really nice when you don't know what all the events are. So rather than coming over here and typing in something, like say you don't know the event name, like drag drop, you can type here, but if you don't know the name, you have to scroll up and down the list and look for this symbol here. Whereas if you're over here in the property window and you've got the event handler section viewing, you can just scroll up and down this list and see all of the known events for this class. And you see when I scroll down to the mouse up section, you see that I've already have a mouse up event handler defined. This is left over from the previous video. Let me delete this and show you how you can add your own handlers. So I'll delete that value here. Now it disappears from the property window. What you can do is you come over here, find the mouse up event, and I can click here. And what I just did is I double clicked in that text box, and Visual Studio looked up the event signature, came over here and wrote this code for me. Now because I already had a food image underscore mouse up event handler already defined here, Visual Studio didn't want to conflict with that name, so it came up with this extension. It added _1 at the end of the method name. So I'll delete this, switch back over to the designer window, to my XAML editor, and remove this code again. Now there's another thing you can do. If you know the name, if you want to create your own name, you don't want to use Microsoft's conventions, you can come here, type in your own name, example method. Now I'll press the enter key on my keyboard while I'm in this text box. Once again, Visual Studio switches me over to my C# editor, and you'll see that it put some code in here for me, but now it used the name that I typed in the text box, not the default name that it picks. Other than that, it's the same. It has the correct signature. Object is the first parameter. Mouse button event args is the second parameter. And I could then take this code here, cut that out of here, put it down in this one. Delete this code now. In the previous example, I had mouse button event args, and I had called that M, the name of the parameter M, and here it's E. So I've got two choices. Either I can switch this back to M, or I can do a find and replace, and everywhere I find M, I can change that to E. Because I think there's only two places. There we go. And I think if I run the application, it'll work the same as before. Now I've got my new pastry picture here. Left button does the skew. Right button does the alternate skew. So what the takeaway from this is, if you don't want to type in your XAML to create the event handler, then you can also use the property windows to accomplish the same task. In this example, I'll look at how to subscribe to an event in C# only. I won't use anything in my XAML to set up the event handler. You can see in my XAML on line 18, I have an image element, and there's nothing in this element that's specifying an event handler for the mouse up event. I'll do all that in code. The most common place that you wire up your event handlers is in the class constructor. So as soon as this class is constructed, this window class, it'll have the event handler in position ready to go. I already have a method written down here. It's the same method I've used in some of my other examples, so I'll go ahead and use this one. So I'll come up here. The name of my element is called food image. So I'll type that in, and then the dot operator. Here's the autocomplete list, and you can see the events listed here in the autocompletion list with the lightning bolt on the left side of the screen. So I'll choose the mouse up event, and then in C# you indicate that you have an event handler ready for this event when it's raised, but with the += syntax like this. Next, I'll come down here and grab this method name, copy that, paste it up here. So this indicates that I have one subscriber. When this event is raised, I have one subscriber, and it's this method. This is actually an instance of a delegate. C# compiler is smart enough to know that I can just use the name here and it'll infer the correct delegate type and actually handle writing that code for me when it compiles. In this case, I only have one subscriber. So when this event is raised, there's only one method to call. That's the most normal circumstance. It's possible for me to wire up multiple handlers for this mouse up. I could set up 2 or 3 of them, and then when the event is raised, they would all get called. But again, in most situations, you just have a single event handler. So I've got it set up. This method down here is the correct signature, so it should work. Let's verify. Clicking with my mouse, and what's happening is I'm doing a mouse down and then a mouse up, and it's the mouse up event that I'm listening for, and that's what's skewing my image. I'll return back to my code and show you another way to use Visual Studio to stub in this event handler. So I'll comment this code and come down here and basically do the same code I did a minute ago. Now at this point, Visual Studio is offering to write some code for me. The name of my image is food image, and it's telling me here that if I press the tab key, it will write this method. So I'll press the tab key, and Visual Studio writes some bits of code. On line 25, it writes the rest of that line that says food image _ mouse up. And then it also wrote from line 29 to line 31 a new method with the correct signature. And you'll see that on line 25 and line 29, they're highlighted in green. That's in case I don't like the name that Visual Studio suggests. So in this case, if I don't like this name, I can come to the beginning of this line and type in whatever name I want. You notice how they both change in both positions, and now I can either press the Enter key or click on this Apply button to have it make the changes. Now you may have a Preview Changes checkbox here. I usually turn that off on my computer. I'll click on Apply, and Visual Studio stubbed in this code for me. It also made sure that it put a throw new not implemented exception in there. So if I don't write any code in here, the first time I try to run this and do a mouse up, I'll get an exception and realize that I haven't written any code in this event handler yet. Notice it suggested a different name. I had this perfectly valid method down here called image _ mouse up, but it didn't suggest that to me like it did in the XAML editor. In fact, if I change this, let me show you one more thing here. I'll come down here and change this to food image mouse up. Go back up here. Notice it's not even suggesting my item. It's renumbering it because it sees I already have this one defined, and so it doesn't want to create a method that would conflict with mine, and it's not offering to use mine. That's a limitation of Visual Studio in this case. Throughout this course, I've talked about the routed event, but I haven't spent too much time talking about what it means to be routed. So here's an example of what that means. When you create a WPF class and you define a routed event, when you register with the WPF framework, you have to tell the framework what kind of routing strategy you're using. There's 3 choices. You can do a bubble strategy, a tunnel strategy, or a direct strategy. In this course, I'll only talk about bubble and tunnel. When you create a bubble strategy, you're saying that I can listen for the event, or I can create an event handler at the child level or any of its parents. And with a tunnel, it's the opposite. You can listen at the parent or any of the children. To make this clear, let's take a look at the hierarchy of elements that I have over here in this XAML file. I start with a grid, and inside the grid is a border, and inside that border is an image element. And there's other elements in here. There's a better tool window in Visual Studio for looking at this relationship. It's called the document outline. You can see it over here on my computer on the left side of the screen. If you don't see it here, go to the View menu, choose Other Windows, then choose Document Outline. And I'll pin this to the side. Now you can see a lot clearer the relationships. There's a food image that's inside a border, and that border is inside the grid. And then the border has some sibling elements, a text block, an ellipse, and a list box. When an event bubbles, it'll work like this. I'll go to my food image, and I'll write a event handler here for, in this case, I'll use the mouse right button up. So when the mouse button is raised, that'll trigger the event, and my event handler will run for the food image. Now I could take that event handler off the food image and instead move it up to the border element. Now when I mouse up on the food image, there's no handler there. So it'll go up the stack to the border. There is a handler at the border level, so the code at that level will run. I could also remove it from the border and put it here at the main grid level. Now when I click on the food image, when I do the mouse up, that event will fire. There's no handler here. There's no handler here. But there is a handler at the main grid level, so it'll get handled there. To be clear, I could specify a handler at the grid and at the border and at the food image. In this case, the event would be handled 3 separate times, and that's okay. It depends on what you're trying to solve with your code. If you need to have it handled at all 3 levels, you can indicate that. But a good scenario where this is a benefit of having bubbling is when you have one parent that has lots of children. Maybe you've got 30 children inside that element, and you don't want to have to write 30 different event handlers, or you don't want to have to specify the event handlers in your XAML 30 times. That's a good use case for using this bubbling strategy. I'll talk about the tunneling strategy in the next video. So let's look at this in a more concrete example. I'll go over here to my grid up here. Let me hide my document outline so there's more room to see in my XAML. I'm looking for this event, mouse right button up. I've already got some code written, so I'll just choose it from this list. And now let's go take a look at that code. I start on this line by adding an item to my message box. This list box I have here, I'm going to add an item, and basically it's just a formatted string that takes what's called the original source name and the sender's name. So basically what I'm doing here is showing you the child element and the parent element, so you can see how it bubbled up to the visual tree. Let's run the app and see what it looks like. I will right click on the ellipse. Here you see it started at the ellipse level, and it was caught by the grid. Now remember, I only wrote one event handler at the grid level. So it got the ellipse got caught there. Now I'll right click on this pretzel text down here. And you'll see it started the text block and moved up to the grid. Now I'll click on this image, right click. And you see it went from the image to the grid. Now you don't see the intermediate element, the border that's around that. I didn't write a handler at the border level. I only wrote the handler at the grid level. And remember, my code is just telling you the child and the parent element that actually listened for this event. Now here's another interesting thing about this demo. This list box is also a child of the grid. So let's right click on the list box. In this case, I got the scroll viewer, which is not exactly what you expect. That's a subsection, a subpart of the list box. But that is there, and it was available for mouse up. And if I right click on one of these items, let's say this one right here, you'll see that it's actually a text block to grid. So you might not be aware, but a list box contains, in this case, a text block that's actually rendering the text. So when I right clicked on this, it showed that it was a text block that was the child element. And since there was no code at the child level, it bubbled up to the grid level, just like it did for everything else inside the grid. And that, of course, is the major benefit, as I've said before, is that I write it once and I get all my children all bubble up to the parent. In the next video, we'll look at going the opposite direction, which is called a tunneling event. Tunnel events move from a parent element towards its children. In this example, I have a main grid, which contains a border, and that contains an image. I will write a mouse up handler here at the image level. Since it's a tunnel event, this is what will happen. When I mouse up, it'll start here at the main grid, and it'll check to see if the main grid has an event handler. If so, it'll run the code in that event handler. Then it moves to the border level, and if there's an event handler for that same tunneling event, it will run the code at that level. And then finally, it'll get down here to the image level. Now, in this case, I could put handlers at all 3 levels, or I could put it just at the parent or just at the child. This is similar to a bubble event. You get to pick and choose where you want to put your event handlers. But the point is that each of these elements had an opportunity to look at that event and decide what to do. The reason we have tunneling events is so that we can examine information about that event and make some decisions to cancel another event. So typically what happens in WPF is you have a pair of events. If you have a tunnel event, there's almost always a bubble event that's affiliated with it or a companion to that. In my case, I'm going to be working with this preview mouse right button up. That's the name of the tunnel event. And by convention, Microsoft always puts the word preview in it. So if it's a tunneling event, it is marked as preview. And it's in the tunnel event that you can examine the information and make a decision to cancel it or add that extra information. In my example, I've written this preview mouse right button up, and all of the methods are exactly the same. They're called all elements preview up. I've indicated that I have event handlers here at the grid level, the border, the food image. So I've got exactly the same code in all of these tunneling events. And basically all I'm doing is letting you see the order that the tunneling events fire. Over here in the code behind, I basically have a counter in here that increments by 1 every time you move down the tree. And then I output the counter number and the name of the element that is listening for that event. And then I've got some timer code up here that resets my numbering system every few seconds so that it starts counting again at 1. This is what the application will look like. I will right-click on this ellipse, and you see it started at the grid and then went to the ellipse. I'll right-click on the text block, started at the grid, then went to the text block. And right here, I'll click, I get grid, border, and image. So he's moving from the grid down to the child. As I mentioned, there are usually paired events. So in this case, I'll look at both directions. I have this other window class here. So what I'll do is go to app.xaml, and I'll change the startup URI to both directions. Then over here, you'll see that I have, let's take a look at the food image. Makes it a little bit easier to read. I have a mouse right button up, and I have a preview mouse right button up. The code is identical to what I showed you in the last example, but this just lets you see it going from the parent down to the child and then bubbling back up to the parent. Press F5 to run the app. Do the text block. So you see it tunneled from the grid, then to the text block. Then it went from the text block back up to the grid. Now I'll right-click on the image, and you see it starts at the grid, then to the border, then the image, and then back up. In the next video, I'll take a look at how you can react in the preview events and do something interesting. What I'll show you is how to suppress the event and not have the bubbling event happen. When you are working with an event handler for a routed event, one of the arguments for the event handler is always of type routed event args, or one of its derivatives.